and not only review it, but ensure that these documents are released to the residents for the lowest possible fee or perhaps no fee at all.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. I think recent events, and even more controversial, perhaps not with the scale of the local issue in Chester St. Margaret's on that connector road. I know the member has been paying attention to the fact that when we were looking at the Convention Centre report, I had in my possession a number of reports that I believe should be made public to continue the debate. In the past, when those things were put out there under FOIPOPs, they were blacked out. What was the use of doing that? I sat in opposition, very close to where you sat. Asked the similar questions. I want you to know it continues to concern me when access to information is important of issues of this nature. I assure the member opposite I'll review this with my staff. We'll look into it. But then again, as a Minister of the Crown, I'm not aware when FOIPOPs are asked of my department. That's one of the things that we've never been told to go near. It's just unacceptable, and the members of the third party should know that experience. They had a similar situation. Previous member from Chester St. Margaret's, God rest his soul, Mr. Chataway, was caught in an uncompromising situation when it comes to be aware of FOIPOPs. And I will tell you the matter will be addressed with my staff, and the people of Chester St. Margaret's can be reassured if the information is available, they'll get it.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, recently I had the opportunity to ask the Minister if she would intervene and help the residents of Rockcliffe Apartments in their fight to remain in their homes. Mr. Speaker, her answer was it's a private matter between the residents and their landlord. Mr. Speaker, it is not a private matter. The previous landlord had an agreement with Community Services and Housing to subsidize units in Rockcliffe that qualified. These residents who are now on low incomes, some on Community Services benefits, cannot afford the $150 per month increase. My first question to the Minister, why won't you work out a subsidy agreement with the residents who qualify so they can remain in Rockcliffe?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. Mr. Speaker, the facts that are with regards to Rockcliffe is that it was an affordable housing agreement. It wasn't a subsidy agreement. And so with the new owner, that affordable housing agreement was not able to be made available because of the circumstances. So therefore, as I mentioned before in the House, if we provide a subsidy at this present moment, that would open the door to every landlord in the province of Nova Scotia requesting a subsidy on the housing unit that is not an affordable housing unit. So therefore, it would set a very dangerous precedent. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South, and your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister responsible, she should know that these subsidy agreements or affordable housing agreements are in place all over the province. It's not setting a precedent here. I'm asking for the agreement to be reinstituted there for people in Rockcliffe who qualify, that are on Community Services. Mr. Speaker, the Minister should know that a single parent with 2 children presently receiving Community Services benefits spoke to a worker with your department in Sydney about her lease agreement and her increase, and was told she could receive a one-time payment of $50, and after that she was on her own and coming up with the extra $150 per month for rent. My question to the Minister, Madam Minister, Mr. Speaker, could the Minister inform the House what the maximum rent payment allowed to those on Community Services benefits, and if it does not cover rent costs, are they expected to pay the additional rent costs from their food allowance?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, once again, we are very concerned with the situation that has presented itself with Rockcliffe. I've said the fact is that it's not an affordable housing agreement at this moment, and that we do have arrangements made for anybody who's on Community Services. We have dealt with each person on an individual basis. So we do have a plan available to work with each and every one of those individuals on income assistance. With regards to the other tenants, we have encouraged them to contact the tenancy board for them to find out exactly what their rights are, and also to contact our department to see if there's anything that we can offer to help them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South and your final supplementary.
The translation to all of that, Mr. Speaker, was that the Minister and the Department have done nothing, absolutely nothing, and the deadline is fast approaching where these people are going to have to pay up with their meager amounts that they have now, subsidize their food allowance in order to pay the extra rent. And she talks about looking after them. There are 360 people presently on the waiting list in the housing complexes in the Sydney area, so that's not an option. Last week, I asked the Minister to meet with the representatives of the residents of that complex and resolve the issue, or at least have our department officials negotiate a settlement with the landlord. What happened, Mr. Speaker, was the following. The member from Cape Breton Nova met with the residents last weekend, accompanied by two... Yeah, it's too bad. He's getting an ovation over there. It's too bad he didn't have the clout to get the deal done that the minister should be doing. Anyway, the member from... as a matter of fact, it's been said that the member of Cape Breton Nova has less clout over there than I do. So, anyway, the member from Cape Breton Nova, Mr. Speaker, met with the residents last weekend, Mr. Speaker, accompanied by two political staff, Mike McSween and Jamie Crane. Not officials from her department, but two political staff. They reminded the residents of Rockcliffe of their rights under the Tenancy Act and dropped off complaint forms and left. That was a total involvement. Okay. My final question, Mr. Speaker, why are you and your department not meeting with these residents who are facing eviction? It is not good enough to spin a political line. Will you meet with the worried residents and solve this issue once and for all?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, what I would like to say is that we started to work on this situation last fall. We were very concerned, and the member from Cape Breton Nova came to me with his concern. He has been diligent in trying to work with this issue. There are some issues that are difficult or unsolvable. It is a private deal. It's a private deal. We were not able to pass along the same considerations as the subsidy. Wasn't the same deal. The owner that sold it was only in the deal for 9 months. Made that decision. We turned over every stone that we could to see if we could have that same deal carried forth. It was not feasible. It was not able to do that. And so what we've done is I have met with the spokesperson for the Rockcliffe. I've met with that individual here. I have talked with her on the phone at least 2 or 3 times. Staff have been in contact. We have worked diligently, and our member of this caucus from Cape Breton Nova went individually to talk to the people because he's very concerned about it. And it's not an easy solution. We can't just be throwing out money to a new owner when it is not part of the process or what we can do about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Cape Breton West is a place of great beauty, good-hearted people, and lots of bad roads. Now, strides have been made in the last few years to improve the most traveled roads in Cape Breton West, but more is required. Along the Mire River, the longest river system in Nova Scotia, is a series of many local roads that are in need of repair. Now, the Mire River is a major tourism destination in Cape Breton. It was made famous by Alistair McGilvery's famous song, Ode on the Mire, and we have lots of people visiting the popular Two Rivers Wildlife Park. Now, if I sing it, he definitely won't answer. Hillside Road is one of the roads surrounding the Mire River, and a portion of this road, Mr. Minister, has been marked and, I'm told, has been estimated. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is this. Can the residents who live on Hillside Road expect this road to be repaved in this construction season?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you. There'll be no singing, but I want you to know that I do appreciate the fact that when I get a question from a member opposite and it includes the new Boston Road, it gets my attention. So based upon the discussion that we had earlier and the fact that it is so specific that I've been told the repair of the first hill at Trunk 22 after the Albert Bridge is on the list. Now, I'm also aware of some of the other questions that you're going to ask me, I would assume, and I'm going to provide a copy of the briefing note that my staff provided for me. There is RIM money that's going to be made available on a number of those roads around the Myra, and I'm aware of the fact that there's ditching and, of course, bush cutting and alders to be removed as I look at the member from Digby Annapolis. Particularly when it comes to the Hillside Road, there will be regular maintenance, including hard asphalt patching. It is high on the priority list. High on the priority list, although it is not yet funded at this time. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West, and your first supplementary.
I want to thank the minister for that detailed answer and tell him that I have talked to several residents along the road and they are willing to change the name to Bruins Drive if that'll get it done. If that is of any consequence. That would be the new name for Troutbrook. Other roads around the Myra River, in addition to the Hillside Road, there are a lot of disrepair. The Troutbrook Road being one of them, or Bobby Orr Lane, Grand Myra North Road and Grand Myra South Road. These roads surrounding the area are so bad that I believe if we took you for a drive, you'd understand my concern and the people's concerns there. As I have informed the minister, these roads are heavily used by tourists and better standards are expected by the people of Cape Breton West. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister is this. Would you commit to having a multi-year approach to the resurfacing of these roads?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
To the member opposite, excellent suggestion. Looking at roads, making sure that you can do them over a number of years. And that is something that my predecessor in the department looked at very carefully at. That's something that's going to be part of the 5-year plan when we look at the progression of roads and that they all can't be done in one particular year. And I'm certainly aware of the Myra, and I've had the opportunity in the past when I've been in Cape Breton, particularly when the member from Cape Breton Nova is behind the wheel of my Jeep, of taking me on a tour of various parts of your riding. I want the member opposite to know that when I finish this particular discussion, which we're having about the roads in your community, I'll be sending over a copy of the notes. I will not be tabling it, I'll be sending it to you directly. I thank you for bringing it to my attention. It's an important and beautiful part of the tourist destinations of this province. The Myra is a part of the important part of the tourism, and it will be addressed by this Minister of Transportation.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West, and your final supplementary.
I again want to thank the minister for his answers, and it's so refreshing to have a minister that can answer questions. Mr. Speaker, the people of Cape Breton West are hard-working people who depend on good infrastructure to grow business opportunities and strengthen tourism that is so vital to Cape Breton's economy, as the minister mentioned. And of course, there's always the issue of having heightened safety. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is this. Would you add these 4 roads to the 5-year plan so that the taxpayers in Cape Breton West can know when they can expect to see improvements on their roads?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, you remind me of that list that just keeps on giving. And I will look forward to the fact of further information that you will have at this time. But I would ask if one of the pages could just take the occasion as I could have this delivered to the member opposite. I want to use the member from Cape Breton West as an example of how, in lieu of the fact that, of course, we did not have estimates, unfortunately, at this time. I was aware of some of the details, although you added a few other roads there, if you noticed, a little bit of editorializing, that's allowed. Considering the fact that there has to be a plan in place when it comes to roads of this nature, considering the fact that we have lots of issues to address, I do thank the member opposite for addressing the matter in this manner, and I will assure you that your roads will receive attention. And I remember being at a roast recently when I yelled at you to sit down, so behave. The
Honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy, since he's so eager to ask questions today. As he's aware, Heritage Gas has the distribution franchise for Nova Scotia and in particular Dartmouth, and many communities are now finding that Heritage Gas is reluctant to distribute to residential homes, even though the pipe might be a couple of hundred meters away. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Energy is, what is he doing with Heritage Gas? What is his department doing with Heritage Gas to ensure that as many residential customers in Nova Scotia have access to gas as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the opportunity to answer the questions in detail, but I want you to know that Heritage Gas officials have met with me on a number of occasions. I plan to continue to meet with them because they are providing a valuable service to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary. Order, order. The time for oral question period has expired. I'll recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call bills for second reading?
Bills, public bills for second reading.
Yes. Could you please call Bill 58, Powers of Attorney Act?
Bill number 58, the Power of Attorney Act. I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to speak to you about the proposed amendments to the Power of Attorney Act. These amendments will modernize the law around the joint attorneys so that it's clearer and better in lines with the other Canadian jurisdictions. An individual who is appointed power of attorney plays an important role in the administration of justice. They are authorized to act on behalf of the person who lacks legal capacity. Preparing a power of attorney is quite common when Nova Scotians are planning for their future. As a government, we want to make life better for Nova Scotians and their families. We need to ensure that the responsibilities are clear when Nova Scotians appoint joint powers of attorney. We have consulted with the Nova Scotia Barrister Society regarding these proposed amendments. The proposed amendments will ensure that an enduring power of attorney is valid in the event one of the two attorneys pass away or one becomes incapacitated themselves. This change was recommended in a 2008 decision of the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia. Similar legislation is in force in numerous provinces, including Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Mr. Speaker, I hope all members join me in moving this bill forward.
Thank you. I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to say a few comments on Bill 58 as the justice critic for the official opposition. Speaker, what this bill in essence does is remove any doubt of what happens in the case of if you have named powers of attorney that you have chosen two individuals. It makes it clear that should one of the individuals pass away or should become incapacitated or unwilling to carry out those duties, then clearly the other person that has been named would have all the powers granted to them under the Power of Attorney Act. This is legislation which is meant to remove any doubt as to what would happen in such cases and to ensure that a person's wishes in appointing individuals to act as their power of attorney are clearly able to carry out those tasks. Mr. Speaker, I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity, as I have on a number of occasions here in this House, to remind Nova Scotians of the importance of having a last will and testament done, and as well a power of attorney so that their wishes can clearly be carried out by those left behind. Speaker, too often I have faced a number of questions, not only as MLA for Richmond as well as being a lawyer, of what happens in the case when someone suddenly passes away intestate and has absolutely left behind no instructions at all. Speaker, it creates a terrible burden on the family that is left behind, the beneficiaries, the requirements, the additional requirements that are required to probate the estate, to establish who the beneficiaries are. It creates a nightmare in many cases. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important, I'm sure the Minister of Justice would join me in encouraging all Nova Scotians to try to make sure that they do have a last will and testament in place so that they clearly set out the instructions as to what they would like to have done with their estate should they pass on. At the same time, Speaker, I'd be remiss if I didn't once again caution Nova Scotians, many who have come to rely on these homemade will kits that one can pick up and almost in a corner store now. They're that readily available. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians would do best to heed to the advice of going to see a lawyer to get their last will and testament done. I had the opportunity to review a few of these homemade will kits, and I can tell you that if they were to be challenged by any beneficiary or someone who felt they had been left out of someone's will, these wills would not stand up to scrutiny under the laws of Nova Scotia. And I know that we have made some changes in our laws here to try to even recognize handwritten wills. Which, Mr. Speaker, as a last resort is an attempt to at least try to identify what someone's wishes were. But clearly, when you go and get a will done by a lawyer, it is clear that those wishes are going to be carried out and that there shouldn't be any questions surrounding them, especially questions on the validity of your last will and testament. At the same time, this bill specifically deals with the issue of power of attorney. Many Nova Scotians do have last will and testaments, but it's only in the last number of years where the issue of getting a power of attorney done has become more popular. And, Speaker, we have seen cases where Nova Scotians have become incapacitated, whether it's a result of a stroke, whether it's a result of a seizure, whether it's a result of some ongoing illness. And then the question becomes, who pays the bills? Who has access to their accounts at the bank? Once upon a time, Mr. Speaker, I know home at the credit union, the son or daughter could walk in and say, look, I need access to mom's account to pay her bills because she's in the hospital. Well, those days are gone, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately. And for many reasons they are gone. It's important now that banks and all financial institutions have much more strict guidelines as to who can access someone's account. So those days of just walking in and saying, I'm here to withdraw money from mom or dad's account or my sister's account because they're in the hospital or they can't do so, it's just not there anymore. And it's very difficult for financial institutions because even though they know the players involved, they have guidelines that they need to follow as well. Well, a power of attorney clearly sets out who will be responsible for making financial decisions for you and taking care of your affairs should you become incapacitated. More importantly, not only over the years have lawyers been recommending that you name one power of attorney, just like your will and testament, we now recommend that you name two. Some cases, some may even name more, but at least two. The idea being that should one of them pass on before you, become incapacitated themselves, or just generally unwilling to do it, possibly they're outside of a jurisdiction, they're in another province, another country, it's always good to have a second person there that is available to be able to carry out those duties. We do the same thing when it comes to your last will and testament now. Before it used to be called the executor of your estate. I believe now it's been changed to the administrator of your estate, some of the new language that is used. But with your last will and testament, we again recommend you appoint two individuals in the case that one should be become incapacitated or unavailable or unwilling to carry out those tasks. So what Bill 58 is doing, it is certainly reinforcing the fact that if one of the individuals you've named as your power of attorney is unable to act, or for the reasons the minister has set out, either deceased or incapacitated themselves, you do have someone as your follow-up to be able to carry out those responsibilities. So with that, Mr. Speaker, as I said, over my 12 years here in the legislature, and I'm sure the clerks will recall, I've regularly raise this issue anytime there has been changes, and I know that the previous government and the previous ministers of justice, the member for Cape Breton North, on a number of occasions, I believe, brought legislation forward in this House dealing with last wills and testaments and with the issues of power of attorney. So this is but another reinforcement of that. But again, I would encourage that the Minister of Justice and all members of this legislature, when you do have the opportunity, encourage your family, encourage your constituents, encourage your friends to ensure that they do have a last will and testament done, that it is updated in the case that it's been 20, 30, 40 years since they had it done, and as well encourage them to make sure that they do get a power of attorney in place to take care of their affairs should they become incapacitated or unable to do so on their own. And I would hope that the Minister and the government will continue to promote this and send that message out to Nova Scotians so that we can ensure that people's wishes, both while they're living and once they pass on, are clearly respected and followed as per their instructions. With that, Mr. Speaker, we clearly will be voting in favour of Bill 58. I'm pleased to advise the Minister of Justice, and we certainly look forward to this bill going on to law amendments. Should there be any recommended changes at that stage, we'd certainly be happy to hear any presentations and to review any recommendations at that stage. With that, Mr. Speaker, I again thank you for the opportunity to speak on this legislation.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in my place today to speak to this legislation, Bill number 58, on behalf of the honourable member for Cumberland South, who is the justice critic. But I do know, as was indicated by the previous speakers, the member from Richmond as well as the Minister of Justice, that sometimes people look at these matters as housekeeping, but they seldom take into account the implications of some of these changes, and more importantly, the strengthening of the administration of these activities on behalf of individuals. And the Powers of Attorney Act is very important, and as the member from Richmond has consistently in this House, in my time, when matters come before it, to remind Nova Scotians about the importance of their will, of having clearly understood their personal wishes and direction, and having people that can serve in their stead if they're unable to. And one of the things that I was pleased that this spring has come forward is actually now it's functioning is the Personal Directives Act. And the Personal Directives Act was brought in to deal with the medical or the personal care needs of an individual, because oftentimes it was thought that the power of attorney gave people that authority, and in fact legally that wasn't the case. They would deal with the administrative, the financial aspects, but personal care was a whole other matter. And because of, as the member from Richmond indicated, society's changed, the checks and balances, the need for following due process, especially within the health field, became important for the Personal Directives Act. And so not only to encourage those individuals in Nova Scotia to indeed make sure they have a will, a professionally administered will, to have individuals that can stand in their stead at a time when it's going to be needed most for them, and that their personal interests and their personal well-being will be served, and that they will be treated in a manner both financially, their care, and indeed their wishes will be executed as they would want. So we've seen some positive movement, and I want to thank all members of the House and parties in the House for being willing to work in a collaborative manner to ensure that these changes have been done. So, and with that, obviously, would indicate the support of the Progressive Conservative Caucus for this legislation, and I look forward to it moving forward and to becoming law. So thank you.
Thank you, honourable member. Any other speakers on Bill 58? If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the insightful comments and the articulation made by my colleagues across the floor, and I move that second reading of Bill 58 be moved.
The question is for second reading on Bill 58. Is the House ready for the question? Question. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill 58, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 352 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Powers of Attorney Act.
Order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 55, Internal Trade Agreement Implementation Act?
Bill number 55, the Internal Trade Implementation Act. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand in my place this afternoon to speak to Bill 55. It certainly will be my pleasure today to move second reading. This is an act, Mr. Speaker, to amend Chapter 8 of the Acts of 1995-1996, the Internal Trade Agreement Implementation Act. This bill was introduced, and you may recall this, Mr. Speaker, was introduced in the fall, but it only received that first initial reading, and it had to be reintroduced in the House. The main thrust of the bill is to allow Nova Scotia to join with other provinces in order to ensure commitments made under the Agreement on Internal Trade can be enforced. This bill will help improve the ability of governments to enforce commitments they have made to each other under the Agreement. The Agreement on Internal Trade ensures that all other governments provide an open and level playing field for Nova Scotia's goods, services, investments, and workers in other parts of Canada. It allows for monetary penalties to be awarded against the province of Nova Scotia if the province is ever found to be in violation of the agreement and refuse to fix the problem. The bill, though, Mr. Speaker, also brings the Act into alignment with procedure and administrative changes in the agreement's dispute resolution process. The bill addresses general housekeeping changes, recognizes that amendments to the agreement require updates to the numbering and terminology in the Act. Mr. Speaker, you may wonder why we would want to enable enforcement of trade penalties against ourselves. Well, the answer is somewhat simple. As each province and the federal government adopts penalty enforcement mechanisms, Nova Scotia increases its ability to enforce our agreement rights against others, if so needed. We cannot achieve that result if we refuse to offer the same results to our partners in the agreement. Nova Scotia remains compliant with our obligations, certainly under the agreement. We do not commit to trade agreements if we cannot keep up to our end of those agreements. We do see the advantage of being able to hold others to their commitments if an issue cannot be resolved voluntarily. And the operative word here, Mr. Speaker, is voluntarily. In order to get that result, all governments agreed to cooperate in enabling enforcement within their respective jurisdictions. All governments, except for Nunavut, have agreed to ratify this agreement, all of whom are in the process of taking formal steps to implement the agreement with any necessary legislation. All parties have until April 2010 to do this implementation. Mr. Speaker, the bill represents a portion of a much larger effort of collaboration to reduce trade barriers within Canada through an agreement on internal trade. This agreement commits the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to work towards the common goal of enabling people, goods, services, and investments to move freely across the country. The agreement focuses on adapting policies to be non-trade restrictive, reconciling standards and regulations, and providing the means to bring closure to trade disputes. This is done primarily by negotiation, but when necessary, it would be done through an adjudicative enforcement process such as the one we are discussing here today. Essentially, It establishes a framework for Canadian governments to work together to develop and maintain an open and efficient domestic market. Mr. Speaker, the Agreement on Internal Trade covers government procurement, investment, labor mobility, consumer-related measures and standards. In addition, it covers agricultural goods, alcoholic beverages, natural resources processing, communications, transportation, and environmental protection. During these uncertain economic times, it is more important than ever to ensure that we have a strong and efficient internal trade system of trade. The signatories of the agreement believe that stronger internal trade practices will help Canadian workers and businesses in all regions improve our competitiveness and productivity, as well as lower costs. Mr. Speaker, here's some background on the agreement. This agreement came into effect in July 1995. It came about because the federal government, provinces, and territories recognized the need to establish general rules. These rules are indeed to prevent governments from creating new trade barriers, as well as reduce existing ones in areas covered under this agreement. It also outlines specific obligations in 10 economic sectors. These involve government purchasing, labor mobility, and investment, each of which cover a significant amount of economic activity here in Canada. It includes the streamlining and harmonization of regulations and standards. Mr. Speaker, it also establishes a formal dispute resolution mechanism, which we are discussing here today. Currently, there is no official mechanism to impose penalties resulting from a trade dispute between participating governments. This includes all provinces, the federal government, and most of the territories. The bill to amend the Internal Trade Agreement Implementation Act will allow monetary penalties against governments that do not implement dispute panel rulings. Mr. Speaker, any dispute between governments under the Agreement on Internal Trade would begin with consultations. The agreement has been designed to maximize cooperation and certainly to minimize conflict. It continues to encourage the voluntary resolution of disputes between governments. If we believe that another government was not holding true to their trade commitments and it was affecting Nova Scotians, then we would approach that government seeking voluntary resolution. That, Mr. Speaker, would certainly be the first step. Mr. Speaker, if those consultations were not enough, the dispute process would begin with the formation of a panel. A hearing would take place 120 days after the panel was formed to allow for written submissions and counter submissions. The panel would produce its report 45 days after that hearing. Mr. Speaker, there will be a new appeals process so that parties can be more certain that the original expert panels have reached the right conclusions. These revised government-to-government dispute resolution mechanisms will, among other things, provide for monetary penalties for larger jurisdictions. These penalties could reach up to $5 million, or in Nova Scotia's case, up to $1.5 million for continued noncompliance with agreement obligations. But, Mr. Speaker, it should be remembered that such penalties can only be applied if the government found not to be honoring its trade obligation, basically refuses to correct the problems within a reasonable period of time. The agreement has been designed to maximize cooperation and certainly, Mr. Speaker, to minimize conflicts between governments. We also recognize that from time to time, differences are inevitably going to occur. They are going to arise. Differences that may require an official dispute resolution process. The proposed procedure offers a range of opportunities to resolve conflicts with a monetary penalty serving as a last resort. It lays out the various steps governments or individuals must follow to pursue a complaint. Each sectorial chapter in the Agreement of Internal Trade lays out its own dispute settlement mechanism. When a dispute arises, the procedures written into the sectorial chapters are to be utilized first. If those processes fail to resolve the problem, the formal dispute resolution procedures outlined in the agreement only then come into play. The steps identified in the specific sectorial chapters entail consultations. In some cases, it will require sending the issue to a qualified judicial panel or a body of ministers. The dispute resolution procedures continued in these chapters recognize that sectorial officials, experts, and ministers are best acquainted and best placed to deal with issues in their respected areas or direct responsibility. The procedure sets out a broad array of options to governments in conflict. These options are followed when the dispute resolution procedures in the appropriate sectorial sectors do not, and I reiterate, Mr. Speaker, do not solve the problem, or when there are no sector dispute settlement procedures specified. Procedures include a consultation stage where an additional broader trade perspective may be brought to bear on issues. There is also a stage where assistance to the Committee on Internal Trade is sought. Mr. Speaker, that concludes my remarks, and with that, I will take my seat.
Thank you, Minister. I'll now recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and speak on this bill. And the first view of the bill, it seems like a really good idea. Internal trade agreement between provinces and all throughout Canada appears to be a really good idea. However, when you look at the poor competitive position that the present government has put the province in, I think it is going to be very interesting to see how all this works in the province of Nova Scotia. It's going to mean that Nova Scotia companies aren't going to be able to compete with New Brunswick companies, Prince Edward Island companies, even a company in Quebec or Ontario. We see our workers' compensation unfunded liability going through the roof at over $700 million. That means there's going to be eventually either less payments to insured workers, which I feel aren't adequately compensated now, or higher fees for businesses. And as the higher fees for businesses go on, of course, it's going to put more cost into Nova Scotia companies, and they're going to become less and less competitive and less likely to operate or be able to export any services or goods outside the province. And in particular, when you export even to New Brunswick, it does have a significant impact on our Nova Scotia economy. On the other hand, with New Brunswick in particular, and I'll just use that for an example, and it can go for any province, with lower costs in any area, they can come into the province and do work here. And it's good to see our neighbours and our fellow Canadians come into Nova Scotia work rather than someone from offshore. But at the same time, it does take employment away from Nova Scotia. And you add that to the HST increase, which is coming, another 2% on everything we buy, and I brought some examples of that to the House before, where if a family does clear, for every $10,000 that they clear after taxes, they're going to lose $200 of that in the HST. So when you tie that together, and then you make it even worse, when the gas prices now are between 5 and 7 cents higher in Nova Scotia than they are in New Brunswick, for example. And when the GST is added to that, they're probably going to be between 7 and 9 cents a litre more, not just for gasoline, but also for diesel. And that means companies, again, aren't as competitive. And when companies aren't competitive, they can't compete. If they can't compete, guess what? Companies from outside the province will come in. We'll have an internal trade agreement, which isn't a bad idea on the surface, and be able to come in here, work in Nova Scotia with lower costs because their home bases outside the province, and indeed compete very successfully with Nova Scotia companies and probably win many contracts. The other issue is, too, that the province doesn't have control over, but the property taxes here in HRM are really getting out of sight, to say the least, and for the services that are received. So that's another cost that's over and above and beyond a lot of other jurisdictions, which again makes companies less competitive, and also making the requirement for people that are working to have a higher income just to maintain the standard of living they have now. Again, the internal trade agreements are always positive. There's some instances, however, that I can give you an example. When we were trying to build a new recreation center in North Preston, we really had tried to get some local content for the badly needed work from very skilled people in the community. And I will give the province a lot of credit at that time. The staff was exceptionally good to work with. They tried everything they could to work through the internal trade agreements and the NAFTA agreements and all the other agreements that were in place. And lo and behold, at the end of the day, we couldn't do anything about it. Luckily, a local Nova Scotia company did get the contract and did employ many people in the community, but it wasn't but it wasn't because of these agreements being followed. It was because we found a good company that was competitive and indeed had an understanding of the community and indeed did provide a lot of spin-off for the community. So these agreements can be positive, they can be negative, but overall it's better to see Canadian companies and Canadian workers working in Nova Scotia, and indeed hopefully our companies working in other parts of the country beside Nova Scotia and generating wealth here. But when you look at all these costs and the way that it's going and the way that the costs are generating going higher and higher and higher for Nova Scotia businesses, it's going to make them more and more difficult to compete outside of the province. And indeed, even inside the province when they're competing with a company that isn't in Nova Scotia. And these things will take a long time to come to fruition. You're going to see a slow and gradual change from companies that we're working here that probably won't want to work here anymore. Their costs are going to go through the roof. For instance, if they're the unfunded liability in the Workers' Compensation Board, just one example, basically doubled over the last few years, and that means there's going to be a substantially higher cost to workers. And as this cost goes up, so will their cost of doing business. And as the cost of business going up, they become less competitive. As you become less competitive, guess what? Just those projects that you should have got, you don't get. And it has a mushroom effect, and it just grows and grows and grows. And after a while, Nova Scotia will not be competitive. We've seen the government take out benefits away from the pensioners in the civil service. People aren't going to want to join the civil service anymore, top quality people, if their pensions are going to be affected so negatively. Another thing that the province did in this last budget. So this last budget hasn't really done very much to help an agreement like this internal trade agreement, although these agreements are very, very important. They're very important to the province, they're very important to the country. But you've got to take it in its whole context and look and see how it's going to affect everyday Nova Scotian. The person that's working in a restaurant perhaps, well, you wouldn't think it would affect the restaurant. No internal trade agreement. But if the individuals that are in the manufacturing industry or in the construction industry don't get that job in Nova Scotia that some New Brunswick company gets, the company comes in, spends money here for a short while, and then they're going back to New Brunswick to spend the profits. And indeed, that restaurant may not have the business they had the year before, the year before that, and those jobs, some of them may be gone. So it has a long-term negative effect. Again, I stress it's a very complex issue because an internal trade agreement is a good idea, but you've got to be competitive within your province to really make it work. And we're not on those grounds right now, and we're getting worse and worse and worse. And as we get more and more difficult for people to do business here, they're not going to do business here. They're going to move out, and then we're going to have some serious, serious problems and make the last recession in Nova Scotia look like it never happened. And it will take time. It will take time, 2 years, 3 years, maybe longer, but it will take time. So with those few words, I'll conclude my comments on this and look forward to the presentations that will come to law amendments.
Thank you, member, and recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise today to take a few minutes and speak to this bill as well. Bill 55, this internal trade agreement. I concur with some of the comments that were made by the member for Preston. Some concerns at the same time. Obviously, the competitive nature of this is a concern, and it's great exporting. Those big companies in the province and throughout provinces are great when they can export their goods, and the reduction in trade barriers that allow that to happen is a good thing, and I'm glad to see that that's in place. And I think part of that bill is very acceptable to that group. As far as the penalty part there, when I was listening to the minister talk about the penalties that could potentially be collected, I hear about dispute resolution, one figure for bigger provinces, another figure for different sized provinces, but how will the penalties ever be captured? I don't know that we would ever actually be able to resolve it enough to pick up a financial contribution to this province, or by way of any penalty. I think it would be tied up for gosh knows how long. As we've seen recently, one of the things the previous government was able to do was resolve an issue with Ottawa when it came to revenues, which was solved, but after how many years? I believe that's something like 22 years. How long would it go with something else of maybe what would be seen as less significant? I don't know. But certainly trade-free barriers are great, both interprovincially, internationally for that matter. We have free trade with the United States, as we know, and others. But I think one of the pieces that we tend to miss here, again, I spoke of the bigger business side of things and the agreements that we would have and the ability to export. Well, what about the imports? What about the small business community who makes up a huge portion of Nova Scotia? What about that piece and their abilities? I don't know that it does anything to help small business at all. I don't think that it does. In a very quick review of this bill, and again, not in its entirety, it's only the amendments that are actually being introduced that are seen in Bill 55 to this. So without having the time to go through yet and have a detailed look, I don't know that it does anything, and probably doesn't do anything to help secure the small business community of anything or protect them in any way, and certainly help by way of bringing in their goods, bringing in workers. Now, I agree that where we're unable to, maybe in this province, supply certain workforces, that sometimes specialists do need to come in to take care of certain jobs, and we're lucky, we're fortunate to have the ability and people that will come in and do those things. So that I see as a good piece. But the agreements that are in place are as the minister has said in his statement, take in many areas, from dollars and cents to labor and the economics and so on. So I look forward to seeing a little bit more. I hope there'll be some presenters that will come in and speak to this bill, although I'm not sure if they're not seeing this just as something that may be a housekeeping item. But I hope that there'll be some others come in and offer some thoughts from the business community and the small business community especially, because as I said, I don't think this does a thing to help small business in Nova Scotia. And it has been previously mentioned with regards to the competition, the sales tax, none of those things are benefiting one of our biggest industries in this province, which is in fact the small business community. There are other huge things. What about our energy agreements and things like that? There's a lot to this bill that I think people are missing. Again, I think they're seeing it as housekeeping issues when it's really a lot more than that. And I hope that people take the time to look into this, both from every aspect, from all Nova Scotians, with regards to those that are interested in the trade side of things, and those that have been affected by trade barriers, continue to be affected, or may potentially still be affected, and that this isn't doing anything to assist them. So with those very few words, Mr. Speaker, at this point in time, on second reading, I will take my place, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
Thank you, member. Now, if I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to acknowledge the comments by the two members opposite. Thank them for their comments, and I wish to close debate of Bill 55.
Thank you. The question then is for second reading on Bill 55. Are we ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. Bill 55, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 8 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Internal Trade Agreement Implementation Act. Order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I announce the next piece of business, Could I be allowed an introduction?
Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, in the East Gallery, we have Hugh Gillis. He's the recently elected president of the Correctional Guards local here for NSGEU in the province. And Hugh, I forget the number, the local number, but nonetheless, could the House please give Hugh a welcome?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before we go into, or ask that we go into committee, the whole House on bills, I ask the indulgence of the House that the bills that were referred to earlier today from the law amendments, in particular Bills 35, the Finance Act, 38, Voluntary Carbon Emissions, 47, Education Act, and 51, Revenue Act, that they be also added to Committee of the Whole. Concurrence of the House.
Is that agreed? Agreed. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I now wish that you do now leave the chair and the House resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole House on bills.
Carried.
Good afternoon. The Committee on the Whole House on Bills is called to order. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, could you please call Bill number 24, the Financial Measures Act?
Thank you. Bill number 24, the Financial Measures Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, in really talking about the title here, the Financial Measures Act, perhaps in many ways, it should be retitled the HST increase, which is one of the main clauses that is in the Financial Measures Act that impacts on Nova Scotians. And during the next while, we will certainly be addressing many of the clauses in this bill, but none perhaps stands out as significant as probably three, which I have alluded to on several occasions now. One, of course, is the HST increase. Second one are the changes to the Pension Act, and the third one is the creation of a fifth level of taxation, but of course eliminating by adding the fifth one, it meant that a fourth the fourth taxation bracket actually ends up with a decrease in taxes for those that are in that category. So, Mr. Chair, you know, the Financial Measures Act that brought in by this government will have a profound effect on Nova Scotians. Some days here in the legislature, we make very, very positive legislation, positive change for the province, and on this occasion, the Financial Measures Act is going to mean some additional hardship, and especially for Nova Scotia families, what we would call the largest segment of our population, working class families, a middle class, if you wish, that will be tremendously impacted by the HST increase. One of the ones that will really come to impact, of course, on all Nova Scotians is on July the 1st, when the 2 cents goes on, which, by the way, is actually a 25% increase in the tax itself, because we're going from 8 cents of provincial tax to 10 cents. So if we look at what kind of increase it's actually on the tax, I know some of the members opposite don't like that, but it's actually 25% of the actual tax of the provincial portion. But it's also means a tax on a tax when it comes to gasoline, when it comes to fuel products in this province. And this is an area that the NDP in opposition spoke out very, very strongly against. There was unfairness in this tax, and yet we see no measure, no plan to make any changes in that regard. And it's one of the ones that actually could bring some real relief to the working class families of Nova Scotia. And so in this case here, the Financial Measures Act really begs that there should have been something applicable to this particular tax. We are against, of course, the tax in and of itself, but then to have a tax on a tax is something that we need to remind the NDP that in opposition, I heard many times, and Nova Scotians won't forget that. Nova Scotians will not forget this, what the NDP likes to claim as their first budget, but is really their second budget. This will not be forgotten because we'll know that Nova Scotians, every time they purchase a product. And how about the small businessman? Out of the $10,000, for each $10,000 that will come through their coffers, $200 more goes off to government. So we are going to see Nova Scotians speak louder, I think, once this tax is implemented. They will not be comfortable with it. It's not a positive restoration, as the Minister of Finance likes to point out. It is not going to be anything of a positive restoration. Nova Scotians have spoken very loud to us in opposition that they did not want this tax at this time, and of course, in particular, the people who will bear the greatest burden, because seniors have been able to get a little bit of help, and those on income assistance have been able to get a small amount of help, but overall, probably 250,000 working class families in Nova Scotia get no help, no relief whatsoever, and it's something that we've been hearing about in the last month. So, Mr. Speaker, as we go through, the clauses of the Financial Measures Act. We will make some comments as we go along. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll take my place.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm very pleased to speak to the title today with regards to where we now find ourselves with regards to taxation in the province of Nova Scotia. And in fact, for a government that is needlessly taxing Nova Scotians and creating extra financial burden, but at the same time we all know it's to try and provide a fix at the cabinet table with regards to a number of commitments during a recession when we should be coming out and economic development being the #1 priority, that indeed, Mr. Speaker, the government's chosen to deal a lot of political maneuvering. And, you know, the Minister of Finance has indicated that, you know, these things were needed to be done, whether it's the pension fund, whether it's the massive deficit of their first budget, their large deficit they just brought in again, a deficit that is being mitigated by a tax increase. So if they didn't have the HST calculation, that what they did was take the back door through the provision that was asked for by the provinces of Ontario and BC. That was their opportunity to walk through that door and to further tax, a tax break that the Government of Canada gave by 2 points to Nova Scotians, and a tax that the NDP have taken away and are giving back, which creates the highest tax rate in the entire country of Canada, and how that could possibly help small business people, the marketplace here at a time when we're looking for economic recovery, how that's going to help the citizens of Southwest Nova that are now experiencing unemployment levels that we regrettably in another area of the province that I'm from have experienced even higher, but it's 17%. How all those unemployed people can bear this tax increase and this tax grab that was facilitated by other provinces changing their regime. And what we know is that it is a negative impact. But we also know, and the minister doesn't highlight this often with Nova Scotians, but in less than 10 months, the government have basically imposed and brought on over $1 billion of debt deficit, thus debt financing. Because when you look at the pension payment, the money had to come from somewhere, but you add it all up, who's paying for it? The taxpayers. That's a reality. Over $1 billion. Over $1 billion, Mr. Chair, in less than 10 months that Nova Scotians are now inflicted with. So while it was to deal with short-term and some of them political fixes, we now have mechanisms that are in play that will have long-term implications. So for those school-age children, they will be dealing with this NDP legacy with regards to the legislation that has been brought forward. They'll be looking to pay it off, and I find it ironic when I've heard so often from the now government members about previous governments and spending and the different eras. But I also know, Mr. Chair, that you have to look at the era in general that those spending issues would have been, what the needs were, what the pressures were with regards to what would have created some of the debt of the province of Nova Scotia. I happen to recall that, you know, during the Trudeau era, there was lots of provinces and the federal government were investing. So too were provinces to match up with that. I also know that people have talked about the Mulroney era where the economy was moving and spending and stimulating. And we have oftentimes heard about the Buchanan days here in Nova Scotia. And I often said, the NDP never tell this House, and the Minister of Finance is always good saying, what would you take away? He likes to talk about a deficit that he said is ballooned. But I'd ask the Minister of Finance, what school would you not have built? What hospital would you not have built? What highway would you not have tried to twin? What projects would you have not have funded? And that's been missing with regards to the minister and his government's approach. They just blanketly look at the past and all was wrong, but all of a sudden they now seem to have all the answers. Well, we know in fact that's not the case, because he tells Nova Scotians, what should I cut? I was in those sessions. Well, what am I going to cut? Well, cutting some of the rhetoric that they had would have been a start. Cutting some of and making large leadership decisions would have been a help. Cutting out just trying to deficit finance, paying off whatever political commitments you've made, that would have been a help. But they chose not to do any of that. But they have chosen to inflict Nova Scotians and add massive debt levels that we have not seen. And the reason we fundamentally disagree with a lot of the approaches is because there is no common sense or context put into the balance here, or the equation here, to achieve some balance, recognizing, Mr. Chair, that we were in a global economic downturn, the worst since the Great Depression. So how it is when you're not focused solely on just the economy and all these other priorities, why you're not focused on the needs of Nova Scotians and how best the civil service can respond and people can provide their inputs. I've often heard, and I've heard them say in this House, well, we're going to go to the front lines and ask them. Well, I can tell you what I have heard clearly is no one went to the front lines. They talked about going to the front lines and talking to those workers that would know best. Talk to the frontline administrative staff or the frontline worker how to find resources and how could you reinvest those resources. How could you make cuts but ensure that the money, if you knew the money was going to go to better service delivery for the other Nova Scotians, the working families that you want to support? Those types of discussions were all great for political rhetoric, but we're not seeing the practicality of it in terms of what the government's actions have been. But we know the impact of this legislation and what it's going to have on working Nova Scotians, on unemployed Nova Scotians, on underemployed Nova Scotians, on Nova Scotians who are looking to have a future here in the province but are considering going somewhere else because of the uncompetitive environment that they've been thrown into. And what Nova Scotians are now saying is, this is great, and it's only natural a new government comes in and they want to blame all the woes, you know. As you know, Mr. Chair, the cupboards were bare. It's worse than we thought. You could have predicted that. The day that, you know, the election was over, you knew exactly where they were going to go. But interestingly enough, we gave them the information. And thankfully enough, I guess in hindsight, because I've been critical of them going out spending at almost nauseum on consultants, but they did spend because they made a commitment to do an audit that the Premier did, and Deloitte were hired to do that. And that audit, once the auditors came before this chamber in public accounts, clarified very clearly that indeed the books were balanced, that generally accepted accounting principles have been followed, that indeed when they took over their analysis in July, that the deficit was only $53 million, that they assumed, those are their numbers, that's not political, those are independent auditors that this new government hired, hoping. But the one thing the auditors had to do was stay because the government put constraints on their review and said you must follow a certain path, because if you do that, we know the outcome was a part of the Sky Has Fallen exercise that the NDP went into was to clearly try to stage that everything was so bad and all the charts to show debt going here and the NDP will come out the other end and hopefully we can get to a balanced budget and make ourselves look like the great stewards of the economy and the finances of the province of Nova Scotia. This piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, doesn't do that. It creates further pressure on Nova Scotians. And while the government admittedly has all the numbers they require to push this through, they'll also have to live with the decisions they've made and the political choices they have made that are hurting competitiveness, they're hurting small business, and they're hurting the working families of this province and do not take into account those of a lesser standard. And that is a reality. And I will happily stand in this House time and time again, Mr. Chair, to to respond to these items. But I know I have other colleagues that want to make sure that their viewpoints are there, and I know. Well, the Minister of Finance would like me to keep going, Mr. Chair, and as he knows, I will. But there'll be many other opportunities to do that. The only question, though, Mr. Chair, is what the total cumulative cost is going to be of how many times we have to rise to speak to the impact of what the government's decisions are and the real cost to Nova Scotians. Because I don't care what anyone says over there, 15%, the highest tax rate in the country, the highest tax rate in the country, the highest tax rate, Mr. Chair, in the country that is being inflicted on Nova Scotians, and the message we've seen about a government that will politically pick and choose which community lives or dies, which aspect things. Well, go to Southwest Nova, the Honourable Member for Queens. You can't travel down there. I don't think you've been there, and you might want to go and pay some extra HST because they have hotels looking for options of what they're going to do. It's a sad day, Mr. Chair, and I guess the member for Queens has provided. It's a sad day in Nova Scotia when the port community of Yarmouth, when one of the Rod hotels has to look at the possibility of reconfiguring their property into a nursing home because there's no tourists coming to fill the bed nights. And that's all it's going to be, is a ghost town at the rate this government and their actions have been. And that's a result, and it's going to be further impacted by the measures contained within this bill. That is a reality. And I don't know if the member for Queens has made a trip to Yarmouth lately, but I hope as sure as heck that she will. And maybe she convince the Minister of Finance to go along for the drive and go down there. And maybe he can bring some more sneakers along that he held out, going the budget process. He seems, because there's people down there who could use some time with the government members. But I also know there will be a chance for the people of Yarmouth to have their say whenever the government chooses to call a by-election down there. And we'll see what those people really have to think about the opinion of the member for Queens and her dismissing them and the impact of this budget on the good, hard-working people there that have been thrown under the Dexter bus. Once again, we see it.
Oh, it's a big bus, Leonard.
Apparently that bus, when you deficit finance the way you are, you just keep buying another bus. We think we know that it's an NDP fleet that's traveling around the province, so more people can be thrown under the Dexter bus. It's now a fleet. Because there's not enough economic activity, maybe they can go and lease some of the Acadian Line's buses because there's not enough travelers, because there's not enough economy for people to be on the roads.
Ambassadors got a few.
Yeah, Ambassadors, Malega, we heard that. But see, there's the real reality. And I, Mr. Chair, am going to be intrigued to see, because the examples are coming forward. And we also know the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, who have been ridiculed in this House by the Minister of Finance and dismissed. Yet at the same time, we've talked to their members and have said, I hope they're speaking up for us because we're really concerned. In fact, it's hurting us. And this government's budget has slowed down business already because people are wondering what the full impact of it's going to be. But the Minister of Finance looked for cover from Chambers of Commerce saying, the Minister of Finance looked for cover, saying, well, I go to Chambers of Commerce. That's not what I'm hearing from them. And then we see the Chambers of Commerce put out their own statements. And obviously, what he might have thought he heard is not the reality of what they write and what they say about the impact of this budget on small business and indeed big business for Nova Scotia. So I think it's great that, the Premier's down in Houston and talking about development, but they won't, as a government in the House, articulate or detail what the direction is, what their plan is for our energy future. And yeah, Houston, we do have a problem. It's called the Dexter NDP. And, that is part of the challenges. So the Premier's saying, I have to go out and talk to people. But how is he going to bring people here to Nova Scotia when he's saying, but yeah, come to my province where we'll tax you higher than anywhere else. We'll make sure that if you don't agree with us, then, we'll yank the carpet from underneath your feet. And if you're agile enough and they can't run you, they'll throw you under the extra bus because they'll catch up with you. So, Mr. Chair, I was prepared to close my comments for this point, but if the honourable members would like me to keep going. Oh, the Minister of Health is agreeing. Well, let me talk about health, because, you know, Mr. Speaker, this budget, keep it going, Maureen. You asked for it, Maureen. This budget, we just heard in question period, this budget from a Minister of Health who they said that they were going to eradicate, that they would make sure emergency rooms were going to stay open. So what did she do? Whoops. She realized, whoops, wrong on that promise. So how do I get myself out of it? Oh, right, we'll deficit finance another consultant. So they deficit financed another consultant for the Department of Health. And you know, Code Orange went from that to Agent Orange, her consultant out there. So we now have Agent Orange going around the province trying to find out how he can give recommendations to the Minister of Health to try and get her out of the political conundrum that she's in, because Chairman Dexter, she started it. Chairman Dexter put out there. And you know, what's interesting is this Financial Measures Act, as all it's doing is taking more money away from Nova Scotians. We have not heard where it's giving them better quality. We have not heard the minister get up and say what she has actually done or what they're going to do. And again, the Financial Measures Act, Madam Minister, is just another grab. And I didn't hear as well the minister go and say that she was talking to the frontline health workers as they promised they would do, and what those recommendations came back. Maybe the report was tabled here, Mr. Chair, in the House. And if the minister has a copy of that report from the frontline workers, as this government said they were going to do to provide for greater capacity for service delivery within the health administration area, I'd love to see it. And I'd love to talk to the DHAs that were consulted fully about how to do that. But they talk one thing, do another. Well, there's the legacy we're getting. So the Minister of Health has a lot of challenges on her hands, and I know sincerely tries to do the best job that she can in the resources. But I'll tell you, Nova Scotians are feeling the impact of the inactivity. So they're deficit financing consultants, and yet there's still a deficit of service delivery for Nova Scotians. And you know, two wrongs aren't making a right. Two negatives don't make a positive when it comes to the NDP and their promises and the practicalities and the real impact of the decisions they've made and the ill-headed decisions that we know are going to yet continue to come in this province. However, I don't know if there's any other members who'd like to say something, because if you got a comment on, is there anyone else who wants to volunteer, Mr. Chair? You sure? Because I could. I'd be happy to give some examples, because I know in Lunenburg West, for instance, Mr. Chair, the people down there are wondering, my gosh, why have the NDP forsaken me? Because they're looking, saying the real impact. Sunday, Minister. Yeah. And I know he's a good honourable member. And, obviously he's in good fit form because the Dexter bus hasn't caught up enough to him. But, there's constituents worried about being thrown under that Dexter bus. But in all seriousness, Mr. Chair, there is nothing funny about the real implications of what this act, with this bill before the House, means to Nova Scotians. And we all know that they may have the numbers, but they don't have their priorities straight when it comes to what Nova Scotians thought they were promising versus now what they've got. And I look forward to responding further on many future occasions.
Thank you. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was a quite informative discussion we just heard from the Conservative Party.
He finishes, that's clause
and
one.
Quite accurate. I don't know where you're going to be able to build all these buses that you're running everybody under, but I'm sure that the backbenchers in the NDP caucus are going to be under the bus as well when this Nova Scotians realize just how serious this tax increase is. Let's look at some of the possible impacts of this, and probably real impacts. So first of all, we've already talked about the price of gasoline going up because of the harmonized sales tax increasing by 2%. It'll make our differential in the province between probably 7 and 9 cents over New Brunswick, our nearest competitor when it comes to working in business. We're going to see inflation go up by 2% because of the harmonized sales tax again in the coming year. And you're going to see the pensions, however, for the civil service only go by 1.25%. So just the cost of the GST is going to really seriously hurt. Going to be soon the majority of people in this province that are retired. So when you look at those costs and you really look at this and see how it's going to long-term affect the province, it's going to be a very negative impact. You're going to see a lot of businesses move out. You're going to see families that can barely make it every day now, probably with 2 people working and a couple of children, not be able to do some of the things they were. And I use some examples, and I'll use them again. For every $10,000 that you clear after taxes, after you paid your income taxes and all your other taxes, 2% less you're going to have to spend. Well, that doesn't sound like too much, but every $10,000 that you clear, you have $200 less to spend. So a family of 4 with mother and father both working, it now means that hopefully clear $30,000 or $40,000 a year. Let's use $40,000 a year after taxes. That's $800 a year gone. Absolutely, they will not have. So that $800 won't pay for your mortgage payment, won't be paid for, possibly won't pay an oil bill, possibly won't pay the car insurance that you need insured, may not pay your house insurance, may not let your children join a hockey team this year. You see the advertisements on TV. This young man goes up to a small business and says, I need a job, and the gentleman responds, what do you need a job for? He said, you're too young, you should be out playing hockey. And he answers, this is why I'm here, because my family doesn't have the money to let me play. This is a story that's going to be repeated over and over and over again. And as you see this continue, it's going to get worse. There's serious talk in this province about in this country and in the U.S. about the interest rates increasing. So here we are, 2% higher harmonized sales tax, possibility, and a real possibility, interest rates are going to go up. Well, now, the government has just in 10 months added $1 billion debt, $1 billion debt. So now the debt service charges are going to be $1 billion in today's dollars. But you take and increase the taxes by 2%, increase the interest rate, and all of a sudden people that had a home may not be able to afford it because they don't have that extra $800 or $1,000 a year to pay that extra interest rate increase. You can all remember the 80s when the interest rates went to the 20%. Hopefully that never happens again, but even if the interest rates double to 6, 7, 8, 10%, it's going to mean a lot of people can't afford to keep their homes, something that they've worked for their whole lives to get. And that little bit extra you're paying in GST make the difference whether you can keep that home or not. Think about that. People have got to realize this. This is serious. And then if the debt service charges go any higher, what's the province going to do? Are they going to cut services again or raise tax again? And I talked before about there's an equation, I can't remember exactly where it is, but I can do the research and bring it back here. If you tax too much, all of a sudden you become in a negative tax regime. In other words, you tax beyond what people can pay. And when you get to that point, the economy slows and the tax revenue drops. And if you tie it in with a higher interest rate and the GST increase and other tax increases that the government has put on through fees and fees for services, all of a sudden you get a situation where we're not competitive in Nova Scotia. Well, not competitive. We're going to a society that's going to be a majority of people that are above 55, not a lot of those people not working, and some will have to return to work because their pension won't do what they thought it could do, and now they've got to pay GST another 2%. So all of a sudden, some people are going to have to go back to work that were looking forward to a retirement. All these things will happen. They will happen. Just a matter of when and how severe they're going to be. And I contend they're going to be quite severe. And anyone that's run a business and knows the minor things that you have make such a major impact. And over time, you're going to see this happen. It won't be this year. It'll only be half of the year this year you're going to have to pay the increased harmonized sales tax. Next year, you'll pay it for the whole year. You'll start to see the impact of it. And next year, as they're predicting, interest rates go up. So you've got a loan, maybe a floating interest rate on your mortgage, and all of a sudden you're trapped into a higher interest rate than you figured, and your payments go up, say, $50 a month. So that's $600 a year. Plus you've lost $600 or $800 or $1,000 a year because you're paying more harmonized sales tax. So you get on both ends. So all of a sudden, you're short on being able to make payments on something that you have. What's it going to be? Is it going to be fewer groceries? Going to be no heat in your home? Is it going to mean you can't pay the insurance this year? And or are you not going to be able to continue that mortgage and have to sell your house if you can hold on to it long enough to sell? If the economy is strong enough so someone can afford to buy it. So as you go through all these things and see the negative impact that this bill is going to create in this province, over time, and I stress over time, it's going to be devastating to the province of Nova Scotia. I talked also earlier about the workers' compensation costs. The workers' compensation costs go up, which they are going to. There's no choice here. There is no choice. The debt is there. So either the province is going to have to write another check and pay it down, which I don't see them doing, and create some more debt in the province, or the employers are going to have to pay it. So the employers are paying this. They're trying to sell something to a customer, and the customer now has to pay not only the cost of the GST is increased and the harmonized sales tax, but also the cost for the workers' compensation that's gone up. And all of a sudden, a $100 bill, instead of being $102 more, could be $110 more, $120 more. So it doesn't take long, if you do the math on all this, to see just how negative an impact this is. And then again, I stress, don't forget the interest rates are going up. All the chief economists are talking about the interest rates increasing. And as they increase, it's going to stall the economy again. We really haven't got this province going again. The only fortunate thing is that we have with the slowdown in the economy is that Nova Scotia takes a lot longer to react to a slowdown. It also takes a lot longer to react to an improvement in the economy when and if it comes. And as time goes on, we're going to see just how this budget will affect all of us, everyone in this province. And hopefully, it doesn't deter the young people that are here, that are going to our universities and going to our schools and technical schools that have to leave the province for another province or another country, indeed, to work, because it doesn't make sense to live in Nova Scotia with an extremely high cost of living that's starting to be imposed on us by this government. A lot of promises were made, a lot of promises. A lot of promises have been not kept so far. And a lot of debt has been generated in 10 months, a lot of debt. And there was the consultant study that was done and that said indeed that the province didn't have this big deficit that the government says they have. They borrowed $300-some million to fund universities, so they created an artificial debt last year. And they've done basically the same thing this year. So as you go through all this and you see what's happening, it's important for us to remember who did this. Remember this when the time comes to hold the government accountable for what happened with these things. And people will remember. People will realize eventually when they start paying that they can't buy as much as they did. It will take a year, 2 years, 3 years before it starts catching up with people. Take $300 or $400, $500, $1,000 out of your disposable income. After tax income we're talking here. It makes a huge difference, a huge difference. So the judgment day will come for the government. I hope people remember the comments I made and my honourable colleagues have made about the negative impact of this tax on this province. And when the backbenchers that had basically no decision to be made on this tax hike and all the other things are under the massive Dexter bus, and that Mr. Dexter drove over them personally in this case, there'll be no factories to build any more buses, so I don't know what's going to happen after that, but it's going to be serious. And my colleagues across the room can joke about this and say all they want. I've been around here longer than anybody on that side of the legislature, and I can tell you, you're in for some rough times. very rough times. And if you joke about this to your constituents, I'm sure you won't be around the next election, quite frankly. Neither will any of your colleagues. This is serious business. This is very serious for Nova Scotians, and it's going to have a very serious negative impact on this province as we move forward. It's nice to say we can do this, but this is a major, major cost to Nova Scotians. Don't forget this. And as people start to realize just how serious this is, they're going to be really mad. They're going to be mad, and I don't blame them. When they start filling up at the gas pumps, you go to the gas pumps, just the gas pumps. Now, you can reduce the amount that you drive, but if you got to travel to work, you can't. You can, if you're a business, you can't reduce the amount of gas you got to buy for your service vehicles, or the diesel you have to put in your trucks, or whatever fuel that you use, or if it's an operation that works in the harbor here and uses boats. I mean, they can't reduce that. Now it's a flow through. The GST is flow through for business, but unfortunately, they've got to charge for it on the other end. So their charge out rates go up, and as their charge out rates go up, their competitiveness goes down. So you got to remember this. So as each one of the backbenchers personally goes back to their riding, and know that the Dexter bus and the bitter deal for Nova Scotians is at their hands and their responsibility, and Mr. Dexter personally comes along and drives over them with his big bus, helped by the Minister of Finance. You'll wonder why you supported this budget. You may laugh now, but this is not funny, and it will indeed have a very negative impact on this province. And one would hope that something miraculous will happen in this province, that indeed we will be able to keep our young people here, we'll be able to make sure our businesses are more competitive. But I can tell you from operating a business for a long time, what this budget does is destroy business in this province to a point we cannot compete anymore. And we get to that point, this internal trade agreement we talked about today will be absolutely the worst thing that ever happened to us. And we see so many other things that are going to be negatively impacted. You'll never believe it. You won't be talking about building new schools. You're going to be wondering how to keep schools open. You won't be talking about emergency rooms closures. You're going to be wondering how you're going to keep any of them opened. You're going to be wondering how you're going to be able to hire a doctor when there's not enough tax revenue to pay all the bills. So the problems will get more and more serious. And anyone out there that doesn't think this could happen really wants to do some soul searching and really look at their personal finances and see how this is going to negatively impact them and their family, and see how this better deal for Nova Scotians is really no deal at all, and it's going to have a negative impact on all of us and this whole province as we try to move forward and help our economy grow and encourage young people to stay here. Thank you.
Thank you. The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm glad to have a few minutes today to rise and talk to this very important piece of legislation being put forward, Bill number 24. And I was sitting here and I was listening to some of the debate. And member for Cape Breton North and member for Preston. They keep talking about these buses, and the first thing that come to my mind was, who's building these buses? Are they a Nova Scotia product? Is there employment involved? Perhaps there is. Maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing. But Mr. Speaker, speaking of buses, I raised a question earlier today in question period with regards to a busing, very seriously, a busing company, Malega Tours, who is a small business owner, John Fursland, who grew up not too far from where I did down the road in Newport Station, done very well for himself. He owns and runs a little tourist operation and stays pretty busy. He gets groups from all over the world, comes in and he pre-books his tours as he has, and he's got a German group, I believe, coming over here in July and August, and lo and behold, his question is, I charged them 13% as the current day law put forward that I had to in GST, and now what happens to the 2%? Will I really have to eat that 2%? For a small business, and he is a small business, he's got a couple of vans and he's got a bus and struggling day to day. He's not, I think he's doing okay. He's keeping his head above water. I don't think a whole lot more than that is the way the tourism industry is today, Mr. Chair, but 2% on the cost of that tour is probably quite significant, and if he has to eat that, it is going to seriously hurt businesses such as John's in that tour industry. He cannot sustain that and I don't know what that will do to his business. I know he has concerns, and we certainly have concerns for him. He's but one example. Mr. Chair, the small business community, which I am very involved in, I hear a lot from. I spend time in my constituency talking to the small business folks and to the big businesses as well, and they're all expressing similar concerns, and that the extra 2% might not sound like a lot, but it's a huge amount. And it doesn't matter what the industry is, if you're purchasing equipment and you're manufacturing and bringing it in or buying it here or whatever the case may be, there are issues around taxes. For the everyday people, of course, every dollar they spend now, there's going to be 2% more taking away from them just for the tax. And I realize the province needs revenue. There's no doubt about that. We know what's been presented, and that's a serious issue in and of itself as well. And but we need to find other ways, Mr. Chair, to increase the revenues, and I know that that can be difficult. And I think that the people of the province understand what's needed to maintain programs and services that are provided by the government of the day. And not one person would probably stand up and say, well, cut this or cut that. That's a very difficult thing to do, because all of these programs are much needed programs, whether you're having grants for building daycare centers or whether you're paving roads, or regardless of what it is that we're doing. And we have to be cognizant of that fact that this will hurt people. The community service clients, for example, in my area, I have a number of them, like a lot of us probably do, can't afford to live now. We've heard, I've been in this house since 2006, and I've heard, I don't know how many times, people stand in their place and talk about the community services folks who struggle to get by, how $3 or $4 or whatever the increase in the rates might have been at the time and continue to be, I guess, is by no means enough. Well, it will never be enough. And that does seem like an awfully small amount, but here we go. We're going to add 2% to everything that they have to go out and purchase. And that is going to be difficult times for those people as we move forward. They're on hard times now. The incentives that we're offering them are almost nothing. What we allow them to keep before we claw back, pretty much every dollar for dollar. There are no incentives. This is one less incentive. This is a huge disincentive for folks to favorably feel like they're going to contribute to the province, favorably get out and want to go to work only to earn a few more bucks and do nothing but pay more taxes. It makes it difficult, Mr. Speaker. We need to think about the construction season coming up, and not only now, but in the long term. We heard the member from Preston speak about the cost of fuel as an example. Big corporations like Dexter, who does employ lots and lots and lots of people, and I'm not referring to the Dexter government, Gary, but I am referring to Dexter Construction, by the way, just so I know we're all clear on that, municipal, and they've fallen under a few other names over the years, and I was once employed there. And I can tell you my father's been employed there probably for well over 35, maybe close to 40 years now. I try to think about how old I am. A long time. And they certainly employ people from all over this province, and now pretty much, I don't know what part of the province they're not in. I think they're pretty much everywhere now, and they're certainly bidding on all these big contracts. And every bit of work that the Minister of Transportation can put their way, we know that corporations like Dexter are bidding on these projects. They're fortunate, they're large, they're big, they have lots of financial abilities, and the machinery that it takes, and so on and so forth. But they still got to buy fuel, and they buy a lot of fuel. And yes, it flows through, but they still have to be able to put it out up front. Does that mean maybe this year there'll be less people employed because they're not going to have enough flow through to carry the labor side of their cash flow? Might only be 1 or 2 or 10 jobs. Who knows what it will be, but it may still exist. We're fortunate enough in the town of Windsor. They're going to the Windsor Daycare Centre. Is moving forward nicely with plans to build a brand new daycare this year. They've tendered, they've got a price, but that price was based on the 13%. What will that mean to $1 million project? Well, that means a lot of dollars, Mr. Chair, are going to need to be found. And the problem with that is, well, you might say, well, you just find the extra dollars, you raise the extra dollars. It's not that easy. It's very difficult. And what will happen there? There'll have to be cuts made to that project and many projects like it, because they're not going to be able to afford to raise that other 2%. 2% of $1 million is a lot of money. And we need to remember that, and we need to remind this government, we need to remind the minister that these people are important people in this province, and they matter. And they're the people that think about this, because it's their pocketbooks they're being affected, and will be affected after July 1st, Mr. Chair. And it's worth taking a few minutes today, as I have, just to to raise a few of these concerns. I know we've heard it throughout the course of the debate through second reading. I'm certain in law amendments, we're hearing it now in committee of the whole, and we'll certainly hear it again as we move into third reading, no doubt. Lots of comments on how this will affect and how this will hurt not only businesses, small businesses, but the everyday Nova Scotian will feel the pinch of 2% every time they go to purchase something. And that's very unfortunate. And I would have hoped that a government, today's government, that campaigned and said that there wouldn't be tax increases would have looked even harder at, and again, I mentioned earlier, we realize revenues have to be at a certain level. We know we're in a huge deficit position. We know that we want to balance the budget. What will this government do differently in the years ahead? We don't know. Will more taxes be added? Perhaps. We know now that they made a promise that they didn't keep, so that it's not beyond them to say in 2 years' time we're going to add another 2%. We don't know where it will go. But this, the action taken in this bill is not the right action in the opinion of certainly our caucus, and I know that I speak for many, many, many Nova Scotians who have emailed me, not just from my constituency, but have emailed me and called me and continue to do so, and I'm certain will continue to do so in the months and the years ahead as this impacts their lives and their businesses and their families moving forward. So interesting, Mr. Speaker, we talk about, we picked on the Minister of Health here a few minutes ago, my honourable colleague did, and he touched on a couple of areas that were significant about ERs and such like that. Yes, stating the facts. He's picking on me, but he stated the facts to the minister and to that government. That's quite true. Thank you for reminding me of that, honourable colleague. But I too want to say, with regards to this, we talk about raising taxes and we talk about investments in health, and I realize the health portion of this budget is huge. It's tremendous, and there's no sign of it going the other way. I've spoke about this many times in this House, about the amount of administration and probably the over-administration. Not that there's not great people there, but we're not looking at some of the other ways to consider a few dollars to be saved, Mr. Chair, and we need to do that as well. But I hear from the folks who work in senior citizens' homes who are saying, we've heard from the government, and they're saying, don't ask for any more. Deal with what you had last year. Well, okay, we're increasing taxes to give them more, or actually to giving them the same or less, and trying to make do. Well, how are we going to give them the same or less when the bills are going up and everything they're paying tax on is increasing? Very difficult. And the Windsor Elms. Now, here's the Windsor Elms, who's just about complete a project that they started that was awarded, thankfully, in a previous government, but it's been nothing but a fight from start to finish with regards to the tendering. So they go out, they call a tender. The process, unfortunately, is the tender's been put out. They have to come back to the Department of Health and the bureaucrats to get an approval on the tender. Well, they hang on to it forever and a day. That costs money. We need to get it out so that the better prices can be obtained. Every day a tender goes by and it's not improved is an increase in the cost. How is that saving money? We know that that's the case, and we need to give some more serious thought to that. And I'm just barely touching on that Windsor Elms project, Mr. Chair, and there's going to be a lot more on that as we move forward in the days and weeks ahead in this House. They're coming down to the end. There's tenders now being held up. We need to get them approved. And perhaps the Minister of Finance would have some influence on the Minister of Health and helping, help. I see that you're recognizing her there, Minister. That's good. And helping her speed up that process by way of getting those tenders awarded, because that is a cost saving in getting them awarded early. And if they run over and the project isn't completed, we're into the construction season. Here we go again. Delays cost money, and I would think that every dollar would count. I would think that every dollar would count to the Minister of Finance. He said that it does, I'm sure, on more than one occasion. He says he's sincere about all of the finances of this province, and that is the best and fair approach for Nova Scotians. Things like holding up tenders, just as one very small example, and I've talked about many others, but this one very small example is not a fairness. It's not good for Nova Scotians. It's not good for the businesses that are building this facility. And the main thing, in my opinion, that it is not good for, that today's government stood on this side of the House. I was here, and they wailed away at the government of the day through various means, question period, etc., about seniors, and we're not doing enough for seniors. And lo and behold, they get over in the government bench, and we're delaying the building and the moving forward and the completion of a facility that has everything to do with seniors. So I'm struggling to get my head around that, as is the board that has been managing this project, struggling to get their heads around how can there be a delay from a government that stood in the opposition benches in support of seniors, but today is slowing the process to help seniors and get them into this much needed facility, when it's a very simple process. Why is it sitting on the desk while the dollars continue to add up, the days go by, the length of the contract becomes longer, the longer the contract, the overruns, the more dollars, the more money it costs. I have a hard time with trying to, as I said, get my head around all of that because it seems so simple. In the tendering process, they've been allowed to do the tender, but not be allowed to award it. I don't understand, Mr. Chair, why we or how we could hold up such a simple process, especially one that's been already approved. And I realize that they're trying to work within a budget, and I know what the Minister of Health would say. You know, this home was budgeted for about $36.5 million or so. They want to be able to stay within that. You must stay within the budget, and I can tell you, on the positive side of this is that the board that has worked with government officials and the Minister's Department and the Deputy have done every possible thing and cut every possible place they could, and have worked very, very diligently and hard to stay within that budget. We're being told, however, that this budget has to be on time, it has to be within or under the allotted budget because we can't afford to go over. I don't know, and I've asked, but I can't recall any time when any facility that's been built has ever been under budget. I don't think it happens very often, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't. I guess what I'm saying is there are opportunities to come in under budget or within that budget, but they're being hampered and put in the way. These delays are taking away from the ability to finish on time, one, and they're taking away the ability to finish on cost and on budget, which is very important. And again, with the tax increase, if you go too much farther beyond the projected date of the coming fall of having this building completed, and certainly awarding the tenders and getting the finances paid to these industries that are providing and doing the work, the more it's going to cost. So how could you possibly, Mr. Chair, stay on a budget that was projected back about 3 years ago when you are self-increasing the expenditures that are going to be put forward in the months ahead? So the sooner that a project like the Windsor Elms, for example, can be awarded the final tenders and costs and be paid out and the work be done, I would say the more money that saves. And I know that the Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia, who is also the member for King South, has been involved in this project, and I'm sure she speaks favourably of it. As a matter of fact, I know she does. I know that she's met with Don McLeod and members of the board, and they certainly speak favourably of her and her input and her help in trying to assist get this project finalized. And I want to recognize her for that and thank her for those efforts, and hope that she continues to work with the minister and stay on the Minister of Health in trying to accomplish this task and complete this wonderful facility on time, and certainly as close to on budget or below budget if possible as we can. So I could probably go on for some time, but I know I'm going to have another opportunity. See, the Minister of Finance is hoping that we'll wrap it up, and nobody's been over there saying anything. He must have got everybody to stay quiet, so I couldn't get on to another topic. Maybe there he goes. There he is. Maybe he wants me to talk a little longer on that, but I'll have another opportunity in third reading, and you know that we'll be back in third reading on this side of the House at least, and in this caucus, to make some comments with regards to Bill number 24. And Mr. Chair, I thank you very much for the opportunity this afternoon to get a few words in. So with that, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Birch Cove, thank you very much. When I look at this bill, I'm concerned about fairness. I'm concerned about, is it right? Is it just? Is it for the public good? And I have to say that I've received a lot of letters about this particular act, and it's from a particular group of people, and you can certainly understand why they're writing. That for these people, they thought they had a contract. For these people, they thought that the government's word was its bond. They signed a contract, and in fact, this government was known for being on the side, or the party of the government, I guess I should say, was always held itself up as a party for the little people. And so these folks thought that they were okay, that their contract would be honored. And in fact, what they've come to discover is that it's not being honored, that they've been left to twist in the wind by their government and by their union leadership. There was no consultation and no warning. And I think that I think what they find so incredibly disturbing is they had no clue this was coming. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, these are not large pensions that we're talking about, by and large. The average one is $17,000. And for these people, a little bit of money is a large percentage of their pension. So they are suddenly faced with the fact that they are not going to be getting cost of living increases. I have heard from so many retired employees, and I would like to take a moment to read just some fragments of their letters. I will, at a later time, read all of their letters, but one woman I heard from, she has been a member of the Retired Employees Association for almost 20 years. So you know that she's probably in her 80s. And she is stunned by this. And she said, what will happen after 5 years? Will my pension keep on decreasing? And she said, this leaves me with great concern about the way our present NDP government is handling our economy. And she says, I look to you for your advice and your help. And so that's why I'm here today. And then I heard from another woman in my riding, and she says, you know, I worked hard. I didn't take a lot of sick time. I didn't use unemployment. I didn't use disability insurance. I often worked holidays. I didn't get the vacation time I wanted, and I did a lot of unpaid overtime. She said she lives a modest lifestyle, and her story is the same as a lot of her colleagues. She said, I had a good work ethic. I was proud of how I worked. And now, they all had a common belief their payoff was this indexed pension that they were promised. And she says, who would have believed, or better still planned, for this situation to unfold to this extent? And then she says, I am appealing to you to do what you can to keep this part of the budget from being enacted. And she says, I don't understand politics well enough to know what it is I'm asking you to do, but please know that I need your help. And then I hear from a man who was a civil servant and who worked for many, many years for a political party that he thought would look after him. And then he discovers, once they get elected, that he says, through it all, our friends in the NDP were there criticizing the government of the day for trying to balance the books of the province on the backs of the civil servants. So you can imagine how shocked and appalled I am to discover the very first budget of my NDP government has again got its hand in my pocket, this time after my pension. And you know, they are justifiably outraged that we as MLAs get a pension after 6 years service when they have a very small pension after many, many more years of service. And he says that he is not opposed to renegotiating the pension plan, but what disturbs him most was that he didn't get the chance to have his say. And I will read his letter in its entirety later. Another woman who indicates that in fact she is not in my riding but in a neighboring riding that is represented by a member of the government, and so she's writing to me to ask that I please do what I can to make sure this Financial Measures Act doesn't pass. She says, I retired almost 3 years ago after working for the province for 37 years in public health services. And she says she's got nothing like a $40,000 pension or anything like that they seem to believe that MLAs get. But she does say she finds it deplorable our government would even suggest changing the indexing. She's disillusioned by the government, and she admits she voted for them, and then she says, big mistake. And she says, honesty and integrity certainly are not words I am hearing these days. I am asking you to intercede for us. We do not want changes made to the indexing.